There's no test, but just I thought this would be a good way for us to kind of recap what we've been talking about. And so, well, I'll make this easier. The answer to these questions on the first page, there's one of three answers. It could be the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, or the Gospel of Matthew. So none of these are about the Gospel of John. Well, actually, one of them is the Gospel of John, but most of the other ones are all about the other three Gospels. So I thought this would be a good way of again, kind of recapping what we've talked about over the past few weeks. So good evening, everybody. Good evening to those of you online. We do have the handouts in the back. So I thought that we would start our study tonight with this opening quiz. So just shout out the answer, okay? That's all you have to do. Which gospel, number one, which gospel does not contain any reference to the birth of Jesus? Well, actually, John does have a reference to the birth of Jesus. And the reason for that is it says in John 1:14, so the Word became human and made his dwelling among us. So that's John's Christmas account, right? Talking about the incarnation and God becoming a human being. So if it's not John, then it's Mark. Mark does not have any reference to the birth of Jesus. Now, which gospel, and again, this has to do with, or the answers here, one of the three gospels that we've talked about so far. So either Mark, Matthew, or Luke. Which gospel places more of a focus on Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus? That would be Matthew. And so which gospel places the focus more so on Mary? Luke. Which gospel narrates the journey that took Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem? That would be Luke. And who was responsible for that journey? Well, in a theological sense, God was responsible, but who politically was responsible? Caesar Augustus, who issued the decree. Which gospel, number 5, which gospel presents Jesus as the new and greater Moses? Matthew, because remember there was the parallel between Jesus and Moses. Like, for example, Moses was almost killed when he was a child by Pharaoh, this ruler who was just bent on destruction. The same with Jesus. He was almost killed when he was a child by Herod the Great. And just like God called Moses and the people of Israel out of Egypt, God also called Jesus and the Holy Family out of Egypt. Which gospel traces Jesus' lineage to Abraham and David, two pivotal figures in Judaism? Matthew. And which gospel goes all the way back to Adam? Luke. Number 8, which gospel gives special attention to Jesus' ministry with excluded people? Luke. And again, we're going to do a sermon series on that for Lent called Including the Excluded. For example, Zacchaeus, we only read about him in Luke. The convicted man beside Jesus on the cross, to whom Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. That's only found in the Gospel of Luke. Number 9, which gospel was presumably written by a Gentile? Luke. That was Luke. And then number 10, what's the shortest of all the Gospels? Mark. How many chapters? 16. 16 chapters. Let's see here. Which gospel seeks to present an orderly account of the life and ministry of Jesus? Luke. See, you all are doing really good. Which gospel was probably the first gospel composed? Mark. Sometime around 65 AD or so. Which two gospels were presumably authored by apostles? Matthew and John. So actually some of the answers are John. And then which two gospels were not authored by apostles but have apostles associated with them? Mark and Luke. And so when it comes to Mark, which apostle is associated with Mark? Peter, because the tradition says that Mark got his information from Peter in Rome just before Peter was crucified upside down by Nero. And why was Peter crucified whereas Paul was beheaded? Exactly. Paul was a Roman citizen, so that was actually a gift to Roman citizens. If they were executed, they would be beheaded. It was an expedited form of death, whereas crucifixion was just about the worst way that you could die. And Peter, tradition tells us, he was crucified upside down because he didn't want to die in the same manner that Jesus did. So whenever you see the symbol of Peter, like in a church, it's always an upside down cross. Do you remember the symbol for Judas? I think it's more like an upside down cross the way I see it. But the symbol for Judas would be bags of money because, he was given 30 pieces of silver in order to betray Jesus. In which gospel do shepherds show up at the birth of Jesus? That's Luke. That's right. See, Phyllis, you're doing really well. In which gospel did the Magi appear? That's Matthew. So Luke has the shepherds, Matthew has the Magi. What were the gifts the Magi brought to Jesus? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And how many Magi brought gifts to Jesus? We don't know, but we assume there were 3 because of the 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh. Which gospel portrays a Roman centurion, in other words, a Roman soldier, standing at the cross as Jesus is crucified? Jesus lets out his last breath, and he says, "Truly this man was the Son of God." It's not John. It's Mark. Remember we talked about the Messianic Secret? And so at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, it says, it says this in Mark 1. This is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And so that's the opening comment. This is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah. And then throughout the Gospel of Mark, we have this theme called the Messianic Secret, this literary motif where Jesus constantly conceals his messianic identity. The demons say, "You are the Son of God, you are the Messiah." He tells them to be quiet. People are healed by him. He says, "Be quiet." You have Peter says, when Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus says, "Don't tell anybody." But it's not until the crucifixion, when the Roman centurion says, "Truly this man was the Son of God," that the Messianic secret is finally out. Because the Roman centurion understands what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah and Son of God. That he hadn't come to overturn Rome, as people suspected, but instead he had come to be crucified. So that's the significance. And it's ironic, too, that it's a Roman centurion, because this guy is not Jewish. He's a Gentile, and not just a Gentile, but a Roman, and not just a Roman, but a Roman soldier, and not just a Roman soldier, but the very Roman soldier who played a role in the execution of Jesus.
So you're not saying Peter's answer to who do you say that I am? You're saying out to the Gentiles.
Well, Peter does say, "Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of God," right? But even Peter doesn't really understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. So I didn't bring this out last time. I'm trying to remember where in Mark. I think that's in Mark chapter 8. Let me pull that open.
I think it's 9:29.
Is it 9? Okay.
Maybe.
Somewhere around that area. I just want to, if you have your Bible with you, you can open it up to this part. You said it's in Mark chapter 9. Yep, you're right. No, actually it is in Mark 8. This is Peter's declaration about Jesus. It says, Jesus and his disciples, this is Mark 8, verse 27. To those of you following online, again, this is Mark 8, verse 27. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was a predominantly Greco-Roman city. Lots of Gentiles were there. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" Well, they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets." Then he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So Peter gets it right. He's the Messiah. But then notice what Peter does next. This is verse 31. So as soon as Peter gives the right answer, this is what happens. Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. So Jesus is saying, yeah, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God. This is what it means for me to be these things. As he talked about this openly with the disciples, so he's being pretty transparent about it, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, and then he reprimanded Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." So you have Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Messiah, but even Peter doesn't understand what that means, because he says, okay, I'm going to be crucified. Oh, no, that can't happen. Because even Peter is caught up in this notion that Jesus has come as a political ruler to overthrow Rome and restore Israel back to the time of King David. So Again, it's not until he's crucified that, the connection between Jesus being the Messiah and Son of God, the crucifixion shows what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah and the Son of God. Let's see here. So now we're at, which question? 21. Which gospel captures the Holy Family's flight into Egypt? Matthew. What are the synoptic gospels? Mm-hmm. And then what is my favorite gospel? John, what we're talking about this evening. So, if you weren't sure of some of the answers to what we talked about above, then pay special attention to what follows. So, just a really quick recap of where we've been so far the past few weeks, and I really appreciate all of you engaging in the study, and I hope that you found it enriching. So, gospel is a genre of literature that we associate with the opening books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. The word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. It's where we get our English word evangelist. And so the Gospels they reveal to us the good news of Jesus Christ. They're not biographies in the modern sense of the term, but they do have biographical elements. The Gospels are most interested in making sure that we as the readers know the essential stuff about Jesus, and that would be that Jesus was crucified, that he was dead, that he was buried, and that he rose again from the dead on the third day. So just real quickly, this is what we've talked about in the Gospel of Mark. Mark is the shortest gospel, as we've said, does not include a birth narrative. If Mark were the only gospel in the New Testament, we would have no knowledge about the shepherds, about the Magi, the flight into Egypt, none of that stuff. So why doesn't Mark have a birth narrative? One possibility is he doesn't know one. He doesn't have any knowledge of what took place during Jesus' birth. Or another possibility is that a birth narrative isn't necessary to his theological agenda. He just wants to get us to the cross, because that's where the ministry of Jesus heads to, is to the cross. It all culminates at the cross. And then Matthew's gospel. Matthew was probably the second gospel composed, sometime after Mark, and he writes as a Jewish Christian whose main concern is to show us that Jesus is a fulfillment of all the promises God made to Israel. And so Matthew situates the story of Jesus firmly in the story of Israel. So his genealogy, as we've said, it goes all the way back to Abraham and David. He makes heavy use of Moses' typology throughout his gospel, showing to us that Jesus is the new and greater Moses, because Moses is the main figure of the Hebrew Scriptures. So the story of the Magi reminds us that Jesus has a royal status, and that would be fitting for a descendant of David. And we talked about this too. The flight into Egypt shows how God called Jesus out of Egypt, just like God called Israel out of Egypt. And so in this sense, Jesus embodies the story of Israel. And then the Gospel of Luke. Luke was probably the last of the three synoptic Gospels composed. And synoptic means viewed together in a similar way, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke generally have the same flow in their presentation of Jesus. John is completely different, as we're going to talk about. According to tradition, Luke, a traveling companion of Paul, wrote this gospel, and because of that, Luke is the only Gentile writer of whom we know in the New Testament. Luke is a physician, but not only is he a physician, he also writes as a historian whose main intent is to give us an orderly account of the life of Jesus. And he wants us to recognize that Jesus is the universal Son of God. So he hasn't just come for the Jews, but he's come for the Gentiles too, which is why he traces his lineage all the way back, Jesus' lineage all the way back to Adam, because Adam is the universal father of all people. And then, as we've said, special attention is paid in Luke to social outcasts like tax collectors, convicted criminals, prostitutes, folks like that. Luke gives extensive detail of the events surrounding the birth of Jesus. He talks about how Gabriel goes to Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then Gabriel goes to Mary. Mary goes and visits with Elizabeth, and then at some point, Mary and Joseph, as they're engaged, they take the journey from Nazareth down into Bethlehem, where Jesus is born. We've talked about the genealogy already. Mary, this unwed mother from a poor village, she's given this elevated role Poor shepherds are present at the birth of Jesus. And then Jesus' birth is identified as good news for all the people. Remember, for unto you was born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. This is good news for everybody. Any questions or comments? Hannah, are we good with people online? Okay. So for those of you following online, we're on page 3. We're going to talk about the Gospel of John this evening. So John was probably the last gospel written, sometime around 90 AD. So probably one of the last books of the New Testament composed. Like all the Gospels, John is anonymous, but tradition tells us, or actually before we go through tradition, the author in this Gospel speaks of a disciple whom Jesus loved. We hear this throughout the Gospel, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then toward the end of the Gospel, the writer reveals himself as this person, as the disciple whom Jesus loved. So this is from John 21. And so just to give some context, Jesus is on the beach. He's with the disciples. Remember, Jesus was on a boat, the disciples were on a boat and they were fishing. And then Jesus tells them to lower down the net. They catch a whole bunch of fish. And so Peter says, "It's the Lord." And he jumps into the water. They have this fish fry on the beach, all of them together. And then at some point, as they're having this fish fry, a conversation ensues between Jesus and Peter. And, Jesus says, "Simon Peter, do you love me?" Or actually, he says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, I love you. Feed my sheep." And then this is what happens next. Peter turned around and saw behind them the disciple Jesus loved, the one who had leaned over to Jesus during the supper and asked, by the way, when it says supper, it's talking about the Last Supper. During the supper and asked, "Lord, who will betray you?" Peter asked Jesus, "What about him, Lord?" So Peter is taking the focus off himself onto this person whom Jesus loves. What about him? Jesus replied, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As for you, follow me." So the rumor spread among the community of believers that this disciple, in other words, the disciple whom Jesus loved, would not die. But that isn't what Jesus said at all. He makes the correction. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This disciple is the one who testifies to these events and has recorded them here. In other words, these events that are recorded in this gospel. And we know that his account of these things is accurate. So, the disciple whom Jesus loved wrote all these things down. Tradition says that this person is John. Eusebius, who was a 4th century historian, he claims that John wrote this gospel. And so John is the person who gives this gospel apostolic authority, because all of the gospels in some way are associated with an apostle. Mark is associated with Mark is associated with the apostle Peter. Matthew is an apostle himself. Luke is associated with Paul, who was an apostle. And then John was an apostle himself. So John is different in the overall makeup, from the Synoptic Gospels. So parables. There are no parables in the Gospel of John. Parable of the lost sheep, the prodigal son, the lost coin, the parable of the sower. All those parables are not found in the Gospel of John. The Sermon on the Mount is not found in the Gospel of John. And John also makes heavy use of double meaning. And so things have this surface level meaning, but then they also have a deeper spiritual meaning. And I'll give some examples of some of those things. So John really writes kind of as a poet. He really wants you to dig beneath the surface. And there's fully developed Christology in John. Christology is a fancy word that means the study of Jesus, right? John's gospel shows Jesus to be the eternal Son of God, that he's always existed with God, and that at a specific point in history that we call Christmas, he became a human being. Any questions or comments? Okay, we doing okay? All right, so the pre-existence of Jesus. In the opening of his gospel, John makes crystal clear that Jesus is the eternal Word of God. There has never been a moment when Jesus did not exist. We say in Silent Night, "Jesus, Lord, at thy birth." But in truth, according to John, Jesus was Lord well before his birth. So this is the very beginning of the gospel. In the beginning, the Word already existed. And when John says word, the Greek word is logos, and he's referring to Jesus Christ. The logos already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there's no question, Jesus is God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. And so John uses this metaphorical language to talk about the pre-existence of Jesus. And as he uses that Greek word, logos, he's hearkening back to the creation story in Genesis. Because how does the creation story begin? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And how did God create in the creation story? He spoke it into being, right? And then notice what John says here in verse 3. God created everything through him. So God speaks creation into being by his word, and that word would be Jesus Christ. That's why John says everything came into being through Jesus, and not one thing was made except through Jesus. It's really cool. And I have the passage there from Genesis. So God creates, and the way that God creates is through speaking. So God creates through God's word. John is making clear that Jesus is the source of creation's existence. And then after identifying the word as light in verse 5, John begins by talking about John the Baptist. And so this is what he goes on to say. This is John chapter 1. God sent a man, this is verse 6. God sent a man, John the Baptist, to tell about the light, so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. John himself, John the Baptist in other words, was not the light. He was simply a witness to tell about the light. The one who was the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people, and who would those people be? The Jews. He came to his own people, and even they rejected him. Of course, he's making a generalization here because many Jews did follow Jesus, but by and large, they rejected him. He came to his own people, and even they rejected him. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn, and this whole discussion of rebirth is going to be brought back up in Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus in John chapter 3 as he talks about being born again. Not with a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. And then here it is, verse 14. So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. The Word became human and made his home among us. The language that's being used there, it's like this idea of like pitching a tent, and setting up camp. That's what God did in Jesus Christ. He came into our neighborhood. He came and he walked our ground. He breathed our air. He lived a human life. Any questions or comments? That's what we're celebrating during Christmas. The word here is incarnation. It's God becoming a human being. It comes from the Latin word carne, which means flesh, like a carnivore. God becoming a human being in Jesus Christ. So I've mentioned that John doesn't have any parables. What John does include, though, and we actually did a sermon series about this during Lent here at Asbury, John does include 7 I am statements from Jesus. And so these statements that Jesus gives, they reveal an important aspect of his identity, but they also take us back to God's conversation with Moses at the burning bush when God revealed God's name to Moses. This is from Exodus 3. So this is Moses. He's tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. He's 80 years old. He grew up in Egypt, but he left Egypt when he killed an Egyptian officer who was beating a Hebrew slave. So it's been 40 years since Moses has left Egypt, and he's minding his own business. God shows up in the burning bush, and God says, Moses, get back to Egypt. and release my people from slavery. Go to Pharaoh, tell Pharaoh, let my people go. It says this, but Moses protested. If I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? Because in the ancient world, there was this assumption that if you had somebody's name, then you could exercise power over that person. And actually, this is true, right? Because if I see you at the grocery store and you're not looking at me and I yell out, hey, Phyllis, what are you going to do? You're going to turn around, right? So in a sense, I've influenced your behavior. And so having somebody's name means that you can exercise a degree of control or influence over that person. So, God, what's your name? This is almost trying to box God in. And God won't have any of that. God replied to Moses, I am who I am. I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my eternal name, my name to remember for all generations. So we translate that as I am in the English. In the Hebrew, that's Yahweh. And if I were in ancient Israel, and I said the word Yahweh, I could be put to death by stoning because you don't utter the divine name of God. It is considered way too holy. So what does Jesus do? He takes the word Yahweh, right? And he says, I am. So Jesus is equating himself with God. He's saying, I am God. And then what he does with these 7 I am statements, not only is he calling himself God, but each of the 7 I am statements in some way connect back to the story of Israel. So when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, that's the first I am statement in John 6. What story does that harken back to? The Exodus, because the children of Israel were in the desert, they had nothing to eat, and God provided what? Manna, that was bread from heaven. And so I am the bread of life, that connects back to that story. And then Jesus says, I'm the light of the world in John 8. What does that connect back to? Creation, yes, but also in Judaism, there was the festival of shelters where when the people of Israel were in the desert, you remember God led them through a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so Jesus actually gave this statement, I am the light of the world, during the Jewish festival of shelters, which harkened back to that period of Israel's history. And then Jesus says in John 10, I am the door of the sheep. Because sheep, of course, think about Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Think about Isaiah, where Isaiah says, we all like sheep have gone astray. And so sheep show up again and again in the Old Testament. That's the same thing with I am the good shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's Psalm 23. I'm the resurrection and the life. In the book of Daniel, it talks a bit about the resurrection. And Jesus says those words, I'm the resurrection and the life, while he's talking about Lazarus has died. And Mary and Martha are upset that their brother has died. And that's when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And then you have John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then finally, John 15, the last I am statement, I am the true vine. A vine for the people of Israel is much like an eagle for the United States of America. It really represented their nation, a vine did. So again, each of these I am statements is deeply rooted in the Hebrew Scriptures. We only find the I am statements in John. They're not found anywhere else. No questions or anything? Or thoughts? Yeah, Dennis?
When Jacob wrestled with God,
Right?
God wouldn't tell him his name.
That's right.
Why did he tell Moses and not Jacob? Any thoughts?
So Dennis is asking about the story where, I'm thinking back. He said, I won't let you go until you bless me. But there was also the part about asking his name.
Yeah, Jacob asked him, God renamed Jacob Israel,
Right.
but he wouldn't tell him his name.
And there's a lot of renaming that happens, right? In the Old Testament, Abram becomes Abraham, Jacob becomes Israel, etc. Sarai becomes Sarah. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Dennis. I'd have to go back to that story and take a look. Yeah. But I do know that Exodus 3 is when God actually reveals God's name. And God does it on God's terms too. And even the name, though, essentially God says, this is my name, but he also is saying, this name is so much bigger. I am so much bigger than anything you could possibly comprehend. I mean, when God says, I am who I am, another way of putting that is, I am being itself. I am the source of existence, which is why it's ironic when Moses finally goes to Pharaoh. I'm trying to see where this is in the book of Exodus. Just give me 1 second here. What's really cool about the Exodus story is you have Pharaoh, who's unnamed. We have no idea who this Pharaoh was. Scholars suspect that maybe it was Ramses the Great, but we actually have no idea because the Pharaoh never has a name. And so you have God, who begins to exercise sovereignty over Pharaoh and over the people of Egypt. And so you kind of see this battle, this showdown that happens between God and Pharaoh throughout the Exodus story. And I'm trying to find the part when Moses initially goes to Pharaoh and what happens. Yeah. Let me see here. Give me 1 second. Oh, here it is. This is Exodus chapter 5. Let's start with verse 1, the beginning of the chapter. Exodus 5. After this presentation to Israel's leaders, Moses and Aaron went and spoke to Pharaoh. They told him, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so they may hold a festival in my honor in the wilderness. Is that so? Retorted Pharaoh. And who is the Lord? Why should I listen to him and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. When he's saying, I don't know the Lord, he's saying, I don't know Yahweh. I don't know I am. So it's ironic, right? I don't know the source of all existence. I don't know the one from whom my own existence derives, right? It's ironic that Pharaoh says all this because he wouldn't exist if it weren't for God. So it kind of just shows Pharaoh's foolishness as he responds in this way. And again, you kind of see the whole thing develop, God continues to exercise sovereignty. He does that through the plagues. And Pharaoh is shown to be this really small, he's not as mighty as he thinks until finally God defeats him when the Egyptian armies are drowned in the Red Sea. Okay, another part of John that I wanted to highlight here, and I talked about this a bit last week, is the way that John uses contrast. Remember, in John, there's more than just the surface level meaning. There's more than just the black and white literal reading. There's always something deeper going on. So we see this in John chapter 3 and John chapter 4 because John pairs two different encounters of Jesus back to back. In John 3, you have Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus, the Pharisee, and then John 4, you have the encounter with the Samaritan woman. So John intends for us to recognize the similarities and the differences between these two encounters. So both Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman take what Jesus says way too literally, and so they miss the deeper spiritual meaning of what Jesus is saying. So what does Nicodemus take too literally? Well, when Jesus talks about being born again, Nicodemus is like, come on, that's absurd. You can't go back into your mother's womb. And the Samaritan woman takes what Jesus says too literally. He talks about living water, and she thinks he's talking about real water, but in actuality, Jesus is using the living water to talk about himself. But besides these similarities, there's lots of differences. Nicodemus comes to Jesus of his own volition. He comes to Jesus at night. He's trying to learn more information about who this guy is. Jesus, on the other hand, seems to seek out the Samaritan woman. In John 4, it begins with this comment in verse 1, I think. It says, Jesus had to pass through Samaria. No, he really didn't have to pass through Samaria. But John's not talking literally, or he's not talking geographically. He's talking theologically. In a sense, Jesus' love and compassion for all people, including the Samaritans, and especially this excluded woman, is what drove him to go into Samaria. Again, you can't just read everything too literally in John. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night. Jesus meets with the Samaritan woman at noontime. Nicodemus is named. We have no idea who the Samaritan woman was. She's unnamed. Nicodemus is, of course, Jewish. The Samaritan woman is a Samaritan. Nicodemus is male. The Samaritan woman is female. Nicodemus is a religious insider. The woman is a religious outsider. Nicodemus claims to know more about Jesus than he actually does. Listen to what he says here in John 3. He comes off as a bit arrogant initially. And then Jesus stumps him. Let's see. He says this. This is John chapter 3, verse 2. After dark one evening, he, that would be Nicodemus, he came to speak with Jesus. Rabbi, he said, we all know that God has sent you to teach us. Your miraculous signs are evidence that God is with you. So he comes off as like, we know this stuff, right? I mean, you're doing all these really cool signs. Clearly God is with you. But Jesus basically responds back, you actually don't know anything. He says this in verse 3. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, unless you are born again, you cannot see the kingdom of God. That's Jesus' lead-in. Unless you're born again. And he's like, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, what do you mean? Exclaimed Nicodemus. How could an old man go back into his mother's womb and be born again? And so Nicodemus, he begins in this kind of arrogant way. We know. And Jesus is like, no, you really don't know anything. Yeah, you're a Pharisee. Yeah, you've gone to seminary and you've learned all this stuff, but you don't really know much. The Samaritan woman, on the other hand, she comes at it with more humility, and she doesn't have the same sense of arrogance, and she makes progress as Jesus is talking with her. And then toward the end, not only does she become a disciple of Jesus, but she also says to the people of her village, can this guy possibly be the Messiah? So she becomes, to the best of my knowledge, the first person to tell others that Jesus is the Messiah. So these two encounters illustrate what we might call a kingdom reversal, that the outsiders are made insiders and the supposed insiders just don't get it. And then, as we've already mentioned, John makes use of a lot of symbolism in his gospel. So things that appear literal often have a deeper spiritual meaning. An example of this would be John chapter 9. So, and actually, Pastor Will mentioned this story in his email today. In John 9, there's this guy. He's been blind from birth, and Jesus heals him. And the physical healing that this man receives leads the man to experience spiritual healing and recognize Jesus as the Son of God. The Pharisees, though, who can literally see, they remain stuck in their spiritual blindness. And so this is from John 9, beginning in verse 35. When Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said. Not just you have literally seen him, but spiritually you have seen him. And he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said. And he worshiped Jesus. And notice, Jesus doesn't stop him from worshiping him because Jesus is okay with that because he is God. Then Jesus told him, I enter this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. Pharisees overhear that, and they don't like that. Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, are you saying that we're blind? So they're smart enough to know that he's talking about them. If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty, Jesus replied, but you remain guilty because you claim you can see. Another example, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And so this is Holy Thursday. Jesus and the disciples are going to share the Passover meal, but they've just come into the upper room. Their feet are dirty, so Jesus stoops down and he begins to wash their feet. It says this, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come. And by the way, throughout John's gospel, you constantly hear this. Jesus will say, my hour has not yet come. Remember when Mary came to Jesus at the wedding in Cana of Galilee and said they're out of wine? And Jesus said, why do you concern me with all of this? Because my hour hasn't come. Jesus' hour refers to his moment of crucifixion when he's going to be glorified in the fullest sense of the term. Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. He's going to show the full extent of his love. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. So there are 4 actions here that are identified in verse 4. He got up from the table, verse 4 and verse 5. He got up from the table, took off his robe, number 2. He wrapped a towel around his waist, number 3. And then number 4, poured water into a basin. First, he got up from the table. Just like Jesus got up from his throne in heaven and left heaven and came to earth as a human being. And then after getting up from the table, what does he do? He takes off his robe. Because in the ancient world, a robe was more than just a piece of clothing. A robe was a symbol of status and honor. It meant that you were somebody if you were wearing a robe. It meant that you were a person of influence and power. And so, remember in Genesis 37, Israel loves Joseph more than his other sons. And so he gives a gift to his son Joseph. It's a robe. Now, traditionally, we thought that it was a robe of many colors. But now, if you actually go to more modern translations, it says a coat with long sleeves, which is not nearly as much fun to color in Sunday school. But we now think that was probably a mistranslation. The King James Version, I think, says a coat of many colors. But more modern translations say it was probably a coat with long sleeves. But the Hebrew is kind of vague, so we're not really sure. But he gives his son a robe. That's the point. And then also in the story of the prodigal son, when the son comes back home, what does the father say as he's reinstating his son? Put a robe on my boy, put a ring on his finger. So a robe was a symbol of status. But Jesus, though, gives up his status. He remains God, but he gives up all the perks that come with being God. Because there are certain perks, right? Depending on what your status is. I remember when I was an associate pastor, when I first got to the church, we had a staff meeting every Tuesday. And I quickly found out that it was important to bring snacks to the staff meeting because snacks always make the meeting more enjoyable, right? People are more focused when there's food. I should have brought food tonight. So I remember the first meeting I was there, the children's minister brought snacks, and then the second meeting, the preschool director brought snacks, and so on and so on. Then I had to bring snacks, which basically meant I would go to Dunkin' Donuts and get some donuts and just bring them. I would never make them myself. But I noticed that the senior pastor, whose name was Mike, he never brought snacks. And so I said to him, Mike, I know I'm new here, but I'm wondering about this. Like, everybody brings snacks except for you. And he said to me, and he did this tongue in cheek, but he said, you don't have to do that kind of stuff when you're the senior pastor. And that was his comment back to me. So I shared that one time in a sermon, and he didn't appreciate that. But, right, I guess if you're the senior pastor, you don't have to bring snacks, right? There are these certain perks. Again, actually, the way he tells it is, in actuality, when they were doing the list one day, he just wasn't there that day, and so he never got on it. But he also never asked to be on it either. I still remember that. I'm actually talking to a therapist about it, so she's helping me through that. Yeah, but there are certain benefits, though, right? That come with a certain status. If you work for a certain company, maybe there's a nice parking spot that you have, right? But Jesus, if you're God, you have everything, right? At your control, at your command. But Jesus gives up all that. I love the way Charles Wesley puts it in his hymn, "And Can It Be That I Should Gain?" He left his Father's throne above, so free, so infinite his grace, emptied himself of all but love, and bled for Adam's helpless race. The Apostle Paul captures this in Philippians 2. It says, Jesus gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. So he gets up from the table, takes off his robe, and then he wraps a towel around his waist. I forgot to mention this in the handout. But wrapping a towel around his waist means that he wrapped himself in human flesh during the incarnation. And then finally, what did he do? He washed the disciples' feet. But the foot washing wasn't just about literally washing their feet. It was a way of prefiguring, foreshadowing what was going to happen at the cross, which is why Peter, if you go to John 13, he takes it way too literally. And so what happens? Let's see, this is John 13, verse 6. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus replied, you don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. No, Peter protested, you will never, ever wash my feet. Jesus replied, unless I wash you, you won't belong to me. In other words, Peter, unless you allow me to do what I'm about to do and die on the cross, then all of this will be for naught. Simon Peter exclaimed, then wash my hands, because again, he thinks that this is more, or that this is about literal washing. Then wash my hands and head as well, Lord, not just my feet. Jesus replied, a person who is bathed all over does not need to wash, except for the feet to be entirely clean. And you disciples are clean, but not all of you. And then he talks about Judas there, because Judas was the person who was going to betray him. And then after washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down and asked, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that is what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash each other's feet. In other words, I'm going to go to the cross, and I'm going to die for you. I'm going to sacrifice myself to you, or for you. This is what it means to love, right? And as my disciples, you are called to embody this same kind of love. Because what does he go on to say at the Last Supper? Love one another, even as I have loved you. And so Jesus is our model for love. Any thoughts or questions? I've participated in foot washings before. I have no trouble with it. Some people get kind of like, oh, I don't know, I don't like feet, but whatever. I'd be more than happy, probably not happy, but I'd be more than willing to do that. We got just a few minutes. Let me show one more example of this, though. This is John 21. And so we've kind of, I alluded to this earlier. When Peter denies Jesus, he does it 3 times. And Jesus asked the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He asked him that 3 times to basically so he can relive the denial. And just to be clear that that's what this was about, notice what it says here. This is John 21, verse 9. This is when they get off the boat and they come back on the beach. It says, when they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. Now, the words charcoal fire are mentioned one other time in the Gospel of John. It's in John chapter 18, verse 18. Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them warming himself. And then that's when, of course, they begin to ask Peter, aren't you one of his disciples? And Peter says, no. So just as he denied Jesus by charcoal fire, there's a charcoal fire set up as Jesus asked the question, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? So again, in John, we really have to dig beneath the surface. There's a lot more going on than initially meets the eye. Okay. Any other questions or comments, insights? Yeah. No, I actually think, and actually, what we have to remember too is that women were the first people to bear witness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and actually, I think that gives credence to the Gospels because, unfortunately, in the ancient world, a woman's testimony was not admissible in public court; it would have been tossed out. And yet the gospel writers made sure to include what historically happened, that women were the first to preach about the resurrection, which means that they didn't make this up, because if they were making it up, then they probably would have attributed the pronouncement of the resurrection to somebody else, right? So this is historically what happened. Women were the first ones to proclaim it. I think that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, so-called Gospel of Mary Magdalene, didn't make it into the canon because of the way it presented Jesus. And it didn't fit with the portrait of Jesus that we have in the from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was just influenced by Gnosticism and other philosophies like that. Yeah. But I love what Jürgen Moltmann says. He says, if it weren't for women preachers, we would have no knowledge of the resurrection. Because Mary Magdalene was the first person to preach about the resurrection. She had said, I have seen the Lord. And then in Luke's gospel, Luke even has the women. They're talking about the resurrection. And then it says the disciples counted it off as nonsense, right? So they were discounting what they had seen. But of course, what they had seen was accurate, that Jesus was, in fact, raised from the dead.
Disciple or apostle, whatever you want to call it.
Matthias,
Yeah. Mary Magdalene.
who replaced Judas, by the way. That's in the book of Acts.
Mary Magdalene had exactly the same credentials, which is she was there from the beginning, from the baptism to the crucifixion.
Right.
But she was not considered, right? Because she's a woman?
Yeah, although there are female apostles mentioned, like I believe, is it Junius, who's the female apostle mentioned in the New Testament? So there were female apostles. Yeah.
Romans.
Yeah, it's in Romans. Yeah, and that's, the Catholic Church would say, unfortunately, that's why they don't ordain women, is because, that Christ appointed his 12 disciples were men, right? That's the argument they give. But there's so much in Scripture that gives us just credence for the ordination of women, just like we have credence for the ordination of men. That God calls people based on gifting, not based on sex or gender. God is more interested in the gifts that he has built into people and wanting people to use those gifts to exercise leadership within the church.
Lydia and
Chris,
Yeah, please.
we can say that about the Catholic Church, but many Protestant
That's true.
churches continue, and of course it took Methodist churches, Episcopal churches,
Right.
et cetera, a long time
That's right.
to enable the ordination of women.
That's right. We shouldn't just, and I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, that is, it is Catholics, but it's also a lot of Protestants. And it wasn't until 1956, unfortunately, that the Methodist Church began to ordain women. Now, one can argue that even before 1956, you still had women preachers, but they didn't have that formal recognition by the church. John Wesley, initially began to discount, unfortunately, women preachers, but then he also saw the evidence of their gifting, and his mom challenged him on that stuff. And she said, and his mom herself was a preacher. John Wesley's mother, Susanna, she would lead Bible studies at the house, and the associate rector at St. Andrew's Church in Epworth, when Samuel Wesley, John Wesley's dad, would travel to London, he would write to Samuel Wesley and say, you need to tell your wife to stop doing this, because he was getting jealous because people weren't going to the services that he was leading. Instead, they were going to the Bible studies that Susanna Wesley was leading at the parsonage or the rectory. And so he writes to her and he says, yeah, you should stop this. And then she basically writes back and says, well, if I'm going to stop this, then you have to answer to Jesus Christ one day. Because, I'm trying to look after these people spiritually, and I'm trying to offer them spiritual guidance. And so when she said that, he was like, all right, I'm not going to argue with that. She was strong. Yeah. And she had a profound effect on him.
I don't think John,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think John or Charles would have been half what they were. If it was just
I don't think it's an understatement to say that if it weren't for Susanna Wesley, we wouldn't be here tonight. She was just, she's the mother of Methodism. And has been called that, rightly so. Yeah. All right, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Any other last-minute questions or comments?
No, but this whole series was great.
Well, I appreciate y'all being here. I know this is a busy season, so thank you for making time for this. Thank you, Eve. Just want to remind everybody, let's see. Next Tuesday, we do have our longest night of the year prayer service. Pastor Will and myself, and I believe Pastor Barbara, will be in the sanctuary to offer prayer and communion. To anybody looking for a special touch from God, we have our services this Sunday. I'm going to talk about the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And then we have our 2 services on Christmas Eve, 5 p.m., 7:30 p.m. Both of those are going to be in the sanctuary. And so make sure to invite somebody to attend service with you that night. And then thank you for your prayers for Art Scott's family. Art was our drummer and the celebration band. I'll be leading a service for Art this Monday at 4 o'clock. It's going to be at a funeral home in Altamont, Baldwin Fairchild Funeral Home. So I actually just met with the family about 2 hours ago or so. So again, that's 4 o'clock. Everybody's welcome to attend, and just keep Art's family in your prayers. Okay? All right. Have a good night, those of you online. Larry? March of the Manger is this Sunday, too. Thank you for that reminder. March of the Manger this Sunday.